when you were telling me how to do my job last week,
Telling you how to do your job?
how to do my job was very, it's quite totally congenial because you mentioned come back to you with 20 questions after I've talked to various other people in the field.
Well,
and I think that's...
See, you only get, first of all, I think you only get what I recollect, and the older you get, the more you forget.
Very
Secondly,
much aware of that.
Huh?
I'm very much aware of that.
Yeah, and secondly, I think that you enrich it. If you have a different view from a different guy, and then you are counterpointing the view. I mean, it just seems to me that's the enrichment factor that you get, as opposed to a one-sided view.
That was my plan of work from the beginning. Of course,
And I was just giving you my frustration with the Center for Military History that sends nice guys, well-intended guys that have no concept of what it is they're doing.
Right.
And actually don't give them much guidance. I wrote them a letter. I didn't write them a letter, I called them. And I told Stoff that I thought it was a waste of time. So he sent down a handholder with the guy the next day.
Really?
Who did not enrich the
He was just there also.
physically present.
Well, I know the guy who's in charge of this program, and I'll talk to him about it. I'm not sure. I think...
Well, you see, what if they want to do it, they ought to try to do it right. And so the way you would do that is you would make it a tandem deal. And there'd be two guys assigned to it, and there were two guys assigned to it, but they both came down here to hear what I had to say, as opposed to one guy going and seeing everybody else as names are raised or whatever it may be, and then trying to push the thing together. So,
That is a much more ambitious undertaking, and that's essentially what I intend to do. But I don't know that the guys that they send to do this are people who are students at the War College, so they've got a lot of fish to fry. I mean, they got to go to school, and they've got to...
Yeah, but the guy comes down here and listens to me for half a day, and so it essentially takes up a day.
Right.
Okay, could the guy do a telephone interview with somebody else?
Probably could.
You know, up at Carlisle? The other guy, he doesn't have to be down here. He can read the data. And, I mean, it's just a sophomore attempt at it.
It's just a data class.
I asked Bernie Rogers one day, did he, what about his oral history? He said he didn't do well.
I noticed that. I went and checked for his. There wasn't any.
So you got any papers up there?
He probably has some papers. I wasn't looking for papers. I was looking at oral histories in a different office from where other things are. And I got Vessies and Crosens and Depew's. And I like to use those so that I know what I'm talking about when I go see the guy. And of course,
He was dead, of course.
I didn't know he was dead.
Yeah.
I have to depend completely on his oral history, which is a very complete one.
There are two of them,
There are two.
There's one, and then there is an update of it.
Okay, they're probably together then.
One, I think, is in a red book, one's in a green.
Oh, right, these are the officially published versions. I want to go to the unexpurgated ones. Yes, I saw those too. I've got some feedback from the National Archives on some of the things that I asked them for, operational reports, lessons learned. I gave you a couple from your unit, but I didn't have the others. I think they've got the others. So I'll get those and give you copies. And also, there's a couple they have on this 5th of the 42nd, the battalion that I tentatively targeted as the one that was...
I think that's the one we're doing, 155 Toad.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where we are.
It's
Came
not-
from Bragg, you said, as opposed to the West Coast.
I forgot what I said to you.
Does it talk about infusion in there?
Well, I haven't got them yet.
I
I've
see.
just been notified that they have them. I was
Yeah.
gonna go get them this afternoon, but I think that because of the weather, I'll scoot for home and get them next week. So then I haven't gotten anything yet. They haven't told me they found anything yet on user VG1. That may be more complicated.
On what?
User VG1 to look for the infusion policy letters. I imagine that process got started when the first unit came over there. It was probably the first unit came with everybody with the same DROs. And people probably started worrying about it.
No idea.
Yeah. Well, let's see if we can run it down. I wanted to.
I told John Johns. You know John Johns?
I do, yes.
He's going to retire, I think, next summer from the ICAP. I think he's the dean at ICAP. And I told him that there were some things that he ought to do, you know, because he's a behavioral scientist. And I said, one of the things you ought to do is you ought to explode the game of the infusion program so that nobody else will ever make that mistake again.
What kind of response did you get?
Well, he agreed. He said, you know, it's interesting, nobody's ever done anything about it.
Maybe between the
Took
two.
it as some golden tablet issued from on high. It must have been a good deal. It came from somebody's higher headquarters. Tells you something about higher headquarters. Higher headquarters are no damn good. No matter what level
No
you're at.
matter what level. I wanted to follow up on some of the things that we were talking about last week.
Okay.
We've put aside the business of providing care, sustenance, and support to your successor, General Howard, in the recruiting command. And it may be that there isn't a story there, or there may be. I wondered if, it sounds like there might have been a story.
Kroll, not Howard.
Oh, Kroll. Okay.
Howard Kroll.
Howard Kroll.
Crowell. Well, let me just touch that a minute, because it's one of those things that says, the guy who is running it knows that the organization that he took over is appropriately organized for combat. And that in the main, all he's got to do is steer the aircraft carrier and things will be all right. Now, from the standpoint of running the functional area analyses with respect to assuring that we have the right number of people by branch in MOS, that aids and abets the proper identification of the mission to be given to the recruiting command. Secondly, we set up our own PA&E shop, which then gave me an entree, since I'd been the previous PA&E. I'd only been away for 2 years. It made it relatively simple for me to control the status of resources flowing into the recruiting service. And so I didn't have any trouble with Vesey in his last year as a vice, nor with Wickham in his first year as a vice, only year as a vice, before we became the chief. So frequent visits, monthly visits by the recruiter into the building, a staff of people who knew that I was going to take care of the recruiting command. kept it going reasonably well. There's a guy who lives up close to you, a guy named Jimmy Simon, Simon. And Simon had been, he lives in Valley Forge, or close to Valley Forge. And Simon had been a recruiting advertising guy. I'd gotten him out of Leavenworth, and he came up and worked with us at Monroe, or at Fort Sheridan. And then when he had served his 2 years up there, I brought him in the building. So I was moving some guys straight from the recruiting game into the building, trying to say to essentially the Washington headshed that if you spend a couple of years out in the recruiting headquarters, like in the PA&E shop or the advertising shop, you could come to Washington and still do that kind of work. I brought in a guy named Bill Zaldo, who had been he comes in a little toward the tail end of my tour as a guy who became the chief of recruiting in the building, because he'd been the head of the recruiting battalion in Sacramento. So we were beginning to get people into billets in the Des Spur who had a hands-on recruiting experience, which substantially improved our capability to go make things happen in the DA staff and at OSD. Now, with respect to the Congress, I was able to, had to go over there and testify on the personnel budget and all that. Well, since I knew all these guys based upon my tenure in the recruiting game, because I had cultivated them, then I was a known quantity whenever I went over to testify about that, and testified for continuing support for the Army College Fund and GI Bill and money for recruiting and that kind of stuff. So the shepherding function at the departmental level, I would say, was much more intimate from the point of view of a lieutenant general manning that store than it had previously been under Yerkes. Now, I'm not demeaning Yerkes. I'm just saying that I had a vested interest to make sure it went right. I mean, if it collapsed, see, the mark of a successful leader in my book is you turn it over to another guy and it works right, but you still have a vested interest in seeing to it that you put several years of your life into something. You want to make sure it continues to run.
The next one I wanted to ask you about was the family programs, the nature of the problems and what was done about them. You said the first year there was a list of 200 things, and whether are some of them listed where you get a hold of them and compare what the problems were with what was done about them. So the list got shorter each year, so apparently some things were working.
Well, first I think that there was a substantial frustration that had been built in the late 70s by the topsy-turvy world of the personnel system, given that NCOs were meeting themselves coming and going overseas. And that in its own right destabilized families.
Yeah, a lot of them, you said, stayed home rather than...
Well, a lot of women, a lot of spouses said, I can't go back over there in 11 to 12 to 13 months. Don't have any jobs, and we need a second income to support ourselves. It's extraordinarily disruptive to children going to school. Don't like the Dodge school in Germany. The medical business is for the birds, you know, can't get the right medical deal. Have exceptional family members that are not appropriately being taken care of. That's one of the success stories of the Army right there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So there were a variety, and then the services on the post don't work very well. Remember now, we're going through the Jimmy Carter budget years, and things just aren't going too well in funding streams. The Nunn-Warner Bill of 1980 for the first time brought pay back into into some sort of harmony with the wages on the civilian market. So here was this non-commissioned officer corps and junior officer corps that had substantial frustration and dissatisfaction. Didn't have any troops when they went down to their piece of equipment. Were not doing meaningful training. Weren't paid the right wage scale. The services on the post weren't operating for their benefit. It was operating for the benefit of whoever was running the service. Lousy medical facilities, short turnarounds to overseas points of view. So there was a tremendous amount of latent hostility on the distaff side. And the way it was affecting us is it was affecting us on good people leaving and good NCOs departing because their families simply wouldn't put up with it. So for however it got started, and I'm not exactly sure how it got started, I do know that you might have to get in touch General Meyer to sort of get him to recollect about that. But you know, in his wanderings around the seeing the troops in the field at post camps and station, I detect that he got enough of this dissatisfaction when talking to family members and wives and husbands and spouses and the like, that it occurred to him that the best way to let that vent was to run a nationally led family symposium.
Did General Meyer go around and visit units more than other chiefs of staff?
No, I think they all try to do it to the very best that they can do. I think Meyer did it very well, and Meyer was advanced from the rank of Lieutenant General to Chief of Staff. And he was a young man in his late 40s when he was advanced to 4 stars. So my general view is that he was probably more in touch with younger people. And people felt more ready to dump on him than maybe some other chiefs. In other words, his demeanor was one of, while he could get irate in the building, his general demeanor outside the building was he wasn't like that. And if I could put this into some kind of context, you see there was a group of 4-star generals, and he was a 3-star.
Right.
Suddenly he is advanced over them. So everybody below him championed him as being their guy, beat out all these curmudgeons.
Right.
You follow me?
I follow you.
So they would be more disposed to dump truthfully on him because they didn't fear him. He was more their age, and they felt that he was their champion among all this quote, those green suiters up there, those guys. And so I think that he had an unusual rapport with younger people, and he was able to get out of them what was biting them. So from all of that, and this, he'd been in office more than a year by the time all this took place. In fact, he'd been in office close to 2 years when he said, okay, it's time to run a nationally led family symposium. So we did that. And it electrified the distaff side that they were going to get a chance to come to Washington and tell Washington what was screwed up about, not about training and that kind of stuff, but about the amenities of post-life. So if you can imagine now that you were at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and somebody said, we're going to select 2 people, one from the NCO Wives Club, one from the Officer Wives Club, and we want you to come to Washington and tell those Hummers up there at Washington what the hell's going on out here at Fort Swampy. You can see that it unleashed an electrifying, uniting sort of proposition. So put yourself up here and sort of look down this phenomenology that's going along here. On the one hand, the units are beginning to fill up with people. The pay raise has come in. And now they want to know what our opinions are of post-camp and station life. In other words, there's sort of, it's capitalizing on some other good things beginning to go along. You follow me?
So you have sort of a holy cow feeling among people that somebody cares.
Somebody cares.
And they're really
somebody took
serious
care of
about
our pay.
it. Yeah.
Somebody finally got us some troops down here. So maybe these guys do care, about what's going on up there. So, I would say that it was a thing that its time had come. And the fact that we did not run it through higher headquarters meant that people were sort of electrified that they'd get the unvarnished truth up to the top.
Right, didn't go through the chain of command.
Didn't go through the chain of command.
Laundered.
Tell those suckers off, and they didn't get a chance to launder it and take out all the bitches and complaints about all that. So when we had that meeting, we had this cascade of things that ought to be done. If you look back at that, I would say that the material was sortable in a variety of ways. There were things that the facilities engineer ought to be doing. There were things that the DOD schools ought to be doing, either in CONUS or overseas. There were things that the medics ought to be doing. There were things that commanders ought to be doing. Now, you recall about the same time, we were still going through these sort of the outgrowth of Bernie Rogers' organizational development, organizational effectiveness in briefings by the new commanders, for example, at division and ADC kind of level. And where the officers were getting a chance to dump on the more senior leaders in terms of how is this organization running and what we're doing, and building commitment to the goals of the organization through off-sites that we're running. So there was some pattern going on here now of how to extract from a diverse work group of, let's say, 10 to 12 spouses, to draw from them the 20 items that they had on their agendas that they brought to Washington. So we had a number of work groups, we had a number of facilitators, we brought in female facilitators, we brought in people who were organizational effectiveness guys that had been trained out at Monterey, California in the OE school. So I think we were able to harvest a menu, although I don't have a copy of it, but I'm sure it's in the files at the, you can get that at the Family Liaison Office. I'm sure you could get the file on the first go at it.
Yeah, there used to be a command, a family.
It was called the Community Support Command.
Yeah, that doesn't exist
But
anymore.
in the Army, there was a office in the desk drawer called the FLO, F-L-O.
Family Liaison Office.
Uh-huh.
And that still exists?
Yeah, as far as I can recall, it does. And they probably got a file on all that stuff we did, because we kept pretty good track of what it was we were doing, so that we could get on with it. Yeah, there's a gal named Whitworth. Her phone number is 695-7714. The Family Liaison Office. But, I mean, the fact that we now have a command that does nothing but manage all that tells you something.
Well, it's going now, isn't it?
No,
It's still,
I don't think so. There's a thing called a community.
Family Community Support Command or something? I thought it was phased out.
Well, we'll look here and see. Community and Family Support Center, U.S. Army. And 325-9461. So, the first one was a overwhelming success. In addition to cutting it by some of the things I just described, there were what the people on post could be doing for it. It was sort of, what could you do at the local level without getting it all the way to Washington? Well, the school thing at the local level operates under guidance from Washington, or the docs operate under guidance from Washington. But the facility support business is largely decentralized, and that could be taken care of. You know, a lot of it could be taken care of at the local level. Just get off their butt. But what it brought up was that there were local commanders who didn't pay any attention to this kind of stuff, who could change the ways they did business. Then there were some Department of the Army regulatory matter that needed to be changed in order to facilitate families. And then there were even some statutory functions that needed to be changed. Now, this led, for example, to a burgeoning cry for family care center, you know,
for kids,
child care
daycare
centers,
yeah.
daycare centers, that kind of stuff. So that led to additional staffing, which got into budget allocations and the like. We put high on the agenda money for child care facilities. I mean, they went from nothing to a lot. We were able to get the chaplains energized, working off some of the, but 200 items on this list to work on. There was something there for everybody. About that time, the Department of Defense, largely through the Army's push, also hired on a lady to be the family liaison person up at the Department of Defense. And the first lady that I recall taking that job was a lieutenant general's wife. And he was a lieutenant general of Signal. Having a blank on his name, but his wife became the sort of the pusher and shover up there. And now it's a deputy assistant secretary of defense.
For family matters.
Mm-hmm. And Carolyn Beecraft, who cut her teeth down in the stuff we were doing,
She's it.
is there. I mean, so that was a terrific initiative. Now, let me just give you a sort of a sense about that. We got one of the things came up in there was we're not taking care of adequately people who have exceptional family members, dependents, either children, wives, or parents, in overseas locale. As a matter of fact, we weren't doing a damn thing about it. So I called in the lawyer, and I called in the docs, and I called in the Dodge school guy, and I said, it seems to me that we are under a federal law, which we were, that the Army had to provide overseas the same care that was provided in the United States, which is done here by counties and states. But it's a federally financed and mandated program. So I said, we got a regulation on this? No. So we were in violation of the law. So I called up Milperson, and Milperson guy came over and I said, bring me the number of Elton. Bring me the number of people who are in our exceptional family member program. This was about 1981, fall of 81.
There was a program.
Huh?
There was a program.
There was a program, but nobody knew anything about it. I mean, if you were a Milperson guy, you knew something about it, but nobody else knew what the hell was all about it. And I said, okay, how many people got in? 1,800. Now, we had at that time an army of about 780,000 people, and there were 554,000 married couples. And we had 750,000 children in the age bracket 0 to 14 years old. And in the civilian domain, about 11% of our families should have declared an exceptional family member, which nominally would say 10% of 550,000 would say we ought to have 55,000 people registered in the program, and we had 1,800. So I called the Surgeon General down, and I called in the Milperson guy, and I said, okay, we are going to, and the Dodge school guy, I said, we are going to, that gal's name is Jean here, I'll get her next, her last name. Retrieval system works slowly.
Oh, that's great.
I said, we are going to comply with the law. We're going to register people. And I said to the Surgeon General, surely you're able to recognize an exceptional family member when he or she is brought in for medical treatment. Oh, sure, we know that. And I said, yes, but how come you're not picking them up as members of an exceptional? Oh, we don't, I mean, that's a parental thing. Surgeon, if you pick somebody up like that, they will think you're intruding on your right of privacy. And, oh, by the way, they perceive that the Army will screw them in their next duty assignment.
Okay, that's the psychology that existed
Yeah,
when you became dispersed.
that's right. So we said, okay, fellas, we're gonna fix that, because what we're gonna do is everybody, of course, what happened then is people were getting off orders
Right.
overseas, which put an additional burden on others back here in the States to go overseas. And I said, no. If we go into the business of sending people to Europe, everybody goes to Europe. Not everybody can't go to Europe. Profile is another deal. I can talk to you hours about profiles. But the whole notion was provide for people like the law says, and that means you docs got to get your act together. You got to put specialists overseas. You're going to have to put shrinks overseas. You're going to have to put going to have to get the facilities engineer to come in and modify houses for people, put ramps in instead of something else. So you're going to have to take care of all these people. Yay, hullabaloo. I mean,
People screw it.
yay,
That's
hullabaloo.
all.
It said, you're going to cost the Army money and we can't do that. And Wilperson said, it's better not to assign them over there, and I said, like hell it is, because you're screwing somebody else. Somebody else has got to go pull that assignment. I checked about a year ago, 1993, and I believe that the number we had enrolled in the Exceptional Family Member Program is like 27,000. Now, what does that mean? Here's what that means. It means that people have confidence
Trust, yes.
and trust in the management of the Army and the leaders of the Army to take care of their families no matter where they're posted in the world, because they voluntarily have now identified themselves as a person needing this kind of care, and the government is furnishing it overseas and at post camps and stationary army. Now that took a year to drive that into the Army, and it took years for people then to develop the trust and confidence that you won't get screwed. In other words, if you're a Hawk sergeant in a Hawk missile system, and we send you to Germany, then we sent you to a site that was within 20 miles of a hospital facility if your child needed hospitalization care, or the DoD school had to have a special facility for you if your child happened to be dyslexic or multiple sclerosis or whatever children may have. So that was a good news. I mean, one of my friends was a major at the time, lieutenant colonel. He said, I'm not enrolled in Mike. He had a youngster in the division. He said, I'm not enrolled in that. I get screwed out of command, get screwed out of a variety of things. He's now the desk of the Army.
Well, how, this is a selling job again.
Yeah, it's an internal marketing it's internal marketing to the Surgeon General, to the engineers, to the mil% people, and then there's another, that's one market. There's another market to the serving soldiers and their families that we're going to take care of them. There was a market upward to OSD that said you got to fix a Dodge school over in Europe, so take care of all that. We didn't own the Dodge school, that was owned upstairs. And so Hilsman is that gal's name. She was the first gal. Jean Hilsman. Hilsman. So that was a good news story, because it said that, well, it put life to a commentary that we always say, which is the Army takes care of its own. And so we were doing it, and people recognized it, and they didn't fret about it. That they went overseas, they knew that they would be satisfactorily accommodated about it.
It's a tricky business because if you start with 1,800 and you provide facilities and care for that number and it quadruples, you need that many more people involved in caring for it, so it gets more expensive. And the more people get cared for and spread the word around by mouth, that...
Well, we knew where we were going. I mean, if you use the sample of the civilian economy, you knew that your 10% of your families had exceptional family number. So, I mean, we knew that it would be an ever-expanding population. But having said that, you know, that was just one of those things that bubbled out of the family symposium, and there were hundreds of items that bubbled out of it. The second year we ran it, we didn't get as many items, but the thing began to take a life of its own. And so you were then confronted with, gee whiz, if we ever cut this sucker off, it'll send the inclination to the field, we don't care about you anymore. So it took a life of its own.
Couldn't stop it, right.
Finally, when I was a vice, I went to Wickham and I said, I think we've gotten about all we want to get out of this by calling it a national symposium, and we want to change the format of it and get a once every 2 years have a group of people come in from the field and tell us what it's all about. But meanwhile, I'll give you an example. There was one of the elements that was into it was the commissaries don't do what we ask them to do, and the PXs don't do what we ask them to do. There's a famous story of Jack Merritt when he was the commander at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The officers' wives club there and the enlisted wives club got together and said that they wanted to have Pendleton clothes stocked at the PX. Well, Pendleton is not a modest priced line of clothing. You know, all wool, you know the stuff I'm talking about?
I have no idea, but I take your word for it.
Pendletons are those very nice looking plaid shirts and ladies' skirts and big heavy jackets. I mean, it's high quality good. And Jack called in, he was commander of Fort Sill, and the Major General, he called in his PX guy who was a civilian. And he said, the ladies would like to get Pendleton clothes stocked at the PX, and he says, we can't do that. And he said, well, they're stocked in the PXs in Washington.
Really?
At Cameron Station. How come they can't be stocked? It's not as if you're not buying it. He said, well, the clientele here won't buy it. And he said, well, why don't you get me the head of the PX system on telephone? So he called up this guy, a 2-star general in Dallas, and said, we'd like to get Pendleton clothes here, but your branch manager says that's not possible. It's too pricey for the clientele we have here at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And he said, I'd really like to get that stuff stocked here. There's enough women here who'd like to get it stocked. The guy said, I'll review it and call you back in a couple hours. So, of course, the pipeline was going down there to Dallas, don't do this. And the buyers in Dallas said, don't do that. So the guy calls back up at Merritt's place. This is on a Thursday. And he said, we can't do that. We appreciate your interest, bring it to our attention, but we can't do that. So Jack said, well, in that case, I'm going to padlock the PX on Monday morning and put an MP on the front door. So we're closing the PX because you won't put the goods in there that people want. And the guy said, you can't do that. He said, I'm the commander of this post, and I can do any damn thing I want to in this post. So he said, I'm padlocking it on Monday morning. Saturday morning, 2-star general was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He brought a raft of Pendleton clothes with him, and they were installed in the PX on that Saturday. And they've had Pendleton clothes at Fort Sill ever since. Now, we went through all of this with the women. I mean, in the feedback sessions and all this kind of stuff. But you don't have to take any shit off the PX. You don't have to take any shit off the commissary. You tell them what you want in the PX. You tell them what you want in the commissary. It's their job to go get it. Nobody ever knew that before. So we began to, and we bolstered this with the information that was put out at Fort Leavenworth and the battalion commanders and the brigade commanders routine. We bolstered the notion that it was perfectly okay to place demands on the system. I recall going to Fort Sill one day when Merritt was no longer the commander there, but I was there at Fort Sill visiting, and as a desk spur, I always made myself available to an officer's wives or enlisted wives symposium. I mean, it was standard fare now. When the head shed went out as a result of this thing, is when you went to visit a post camper station, you set up a time when the distaff side could come in and tell you what for. So I mean, this whole thing was sort of opening up the dialogue up and down the chain of authority.
Right.
So I went in there one day in Fort Sill, and this lady says to me, nice group of ladies, says, General, is there any chance that we could get a light put up at the PX? And I said, tell me why you need a light put up at the PX. I said, well, there's a housing area across the PX, and kids are going to the PX all the time. The only thing is